And that's what Donald Trump and the Putinists in our own government want to do.
More panic mongering from the stupid leftists. So,
well, you can shake your head if you want to. That's a fact.
Stop pretending that we don't have United States Special Forces on the ground right this second. That southern drawl where you try to make yourself sound likable because you have it.
Is the guy who smokes and spends all day arguing with strippers and OnlyFans girls going to speak up? I don't know.
They make better arguments than you do, bro.
What's happening with Hunter Biden and the CIA? Burisma was a CIA operation.
Welcome back to Rattlesnake TV, guys. I thought that Christmas had come early this morning when I woke up and realized that probably two of my favorite, if not my two favorite political commentators, Andrew Wilson and Dave Smith, had teamed up against a few libs on the topic of Trump and Ukraine. I watch Dave's show, Part of the Problem, at least a few times a week. And if you guys haven't already checked it out, Andrew and I have our own political and social commentary show. It's called Not One Step Back, and we have already released 2 episodes and will be releasing many, many more. So check that out. At the end of the video, I'll leave some links, and also the links will be down below for you. So let's kick this off with a very soy take from the lib on the panel and watch Andrew's blistering response.
What happened in the Oval Office on Friday sent shockwaves around the world about whether America was going to continue being with Europe when it came to issues like the invasion of a sovereign democratic European country by a Russian dictator. How concerned are you that we might see a genuine fracturing here?
Last Friday was shocking, but unfortunately, I'm not surprised. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance just trashed the 80-year transatlantic partnership that has kept all of us safe in the Western world. And now all of our allies are asking, can we trust Donald Trump? Can we trust the United States? Are they a good faith partner? Canada is already preparing for the worst. And now all of our partners in Europe, as well as our partners in the Asia Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, the entire democratic world is wondering, will the United States honor their commitments? If a treaty has been signed by the US Congress, Donald Trump can't arbitrarily break it. That's in violation of federal and international law. But right now, Donald Trump says, I have the power to do whatever I want. I can make law. I can discern what the law is. Nobody can stop me. Nobody can check me. And we've entered a new age. I don't think anyone alive today really remembers what it was like back in the age of empires, prior to World War I, prior to World War II. And that's what Donald Trump and the Putinists in our own government want to do. The United States wants to ally. Our government wants to ally with Russia against our smaller, weaker, democratic, traditional allies. These alliances were built on shared values, respecting democracy, international law, human rights, 3 things that Donald Trump doesn't care about, 3 things that Vladimir Putin doesn't care about. And if the American people don't rise up now and put a stop to this, then we're going to have a lot more wars.
Okay.
A lot more wars, as Xi wants to redraw the maps, Putin wants to redraw the maps, and Trump wants to redraw the maps.
Okay. Andrew Wilson, your response to that?
Yeah, so I mean, more panic mongering from the stupid leftists. So anything they can do to say, oh, Zelensky's a hero. This guy, by the way, in the paradox of freedom, who's pressing people into service in his country, don't want to go, while he's in a great battle for freedom. He went to the White House and completely embarrassed himself. He decided to have a massive argument in front of the American people, which should not have happened, in the middle of trying to get some type of peace treaty together on behalf of his own nation. Do leftists hold him accountable? Of course not. Instead, somehow, it's always Donald Trump's fault. By the way, this is our treasure, my money that's going over to Ukraine in order to fund this rapidly growing bloodbath that you so desperately want. Well, at the same time, you say, well, Andrew, don't you think that it's all because Putin is so bad? It's like, look, there's no good guys here. Stop pretending that I need to follow this dialectic, that there's good guys who are involved in this. Ukraine was always a corrupt government. The Russian government's a corrupt oligarchical government, and they're at war with each other. And I don't want my treasure to go over there, and I don't want my kids to go over there and fight a war. I'm sorry, but I think that we will refrain from entering into another European theater. As you bring up, people don't really understand what it was like, in these pre-imperial dynasties. yeah, the thing is like we do have grandparents or great grandparents left alive who were part of these European theaters, and they were bloodbaths, absolute bloodbaths. And what we need right now is a peace treaty, not any more of your cocksure posturing about the good guy Zelensky and the bad guy Putin. It's a false dialectic, and I'm sick of it.
Absolutely 100% agree with Andrew there, as you might expect. You see, the ultimate gaslighting in this situation comes from those people who say that Ukraine is just a poor, innocent little democracy. And they were invaded by the big mean Putin for no good reason besides the fact that he wants to take over the world. And Ukraine are just such a great ally to democracy. And if we don't stop and defeat Putin, then the whole world will just fall to strongman dictators. But on the other hand, whilst acknowledging that Russia were in fact provoked into this war, and also being somebody who admires Russian history, I mean, there is some great culture that has come from that part of the world, some of the great bits of literature. You've got Dostoevsky, you've got Tolstoy, Solzhenitsyn. In terms of music, you've got Tchaikovsky. It's a very important region of the world for Orthodox Christianity. So, I mean, I have some very positive things to say about pre-Bolshevik Russia. But to think that modern Russia is just some victim in all of this is also not a very good take. Russia is indeed a very corrupt nation. Putin is a guy who is a former KGB spy that worked in various different foreign intelligence and counterintelligence operations for the Soviet Union. So, I mean, I can certainly understand Russia's perspective in this particular conflict. But if you think that Putin has America's and the collective West's best interests in mind, then I have a bridge to sell you. But these views aren't actually contradictory to hold, because if you go too far to one side, then you inevitably will provoke Putin into what will become World War III. But then if you take it too far to the other side, then you will have the wool pulled over your eyes if you think he's your friend. Anyway, on to the next part now, where some very interesting points are made about empire.
So there comes a point, does there not, where I completely understand why a lot of Americans are simply done with being the global police officer. Why should they be? If the Europeans aren't prepared to take their own defences seriously enough, why should America constantly feel obliged to come in and spend American taxpayer money on bailing them out?
The honest answer is because America has been writing the security policy for these countries since World War II. If America makes all the decisions, America calls the shots in this alliance, what incentive is there for our allies to spend increased amounts? Should they have been meeting that 2% NATO guideline? Of course they should, but they were lulled into a false sense of security, both from the United States and from the Russians. This entire plan of making Europe dependent on Russian energy exports, nations that trade together don't go to war with each other, we now know that's a lie. This was a post-communist collapse experiment. What if we economically intertwined ourselves with the Chinese, with the Russians? We make this globalization effort in order to connect them. That way, they won't want to risk their trade partners in order to go to war with their neighbors. And what we've learned in the last 3 years is that we were wrong. We never should have made our economy, our energy needs dependent on either the Chinese or the Russians, because they're dictatorships and they're authoritarians and they want to be empires. They want to invade their smaller, weaker neighbors or topple their governments, either create proxy states or redraw the maps. So now nobody can deny the reality. Nobody can deny the truth. Every democracy in the world has to reevaluate their trade partnerships and their food and energy supplies, because you cannot be reliant on dictators. You cannot be reliant on either China or Russia, because they will use those trade relations as leverage to get what they want on the battlefield, to get concessions from democratic nations that do try to negotiate in good faith. When the Russians and the Chinese will never negotiate in good faith. They will always make maximum demands. They will always lie. They will always cheat. They will always steal. You can't trust them. You shouldn't be working with them. And right now, Donald Trump is trying to negotiate an aluminum deal with the Russians. Donald Trump is trying to resume direct flights between the United States and Moscow on stolen planes. All of these aircraft that the Russians stole 3 years ago, Donald Trump wants to pretend like it never happened. We're trying to increase diplomatic staff when we know these people are all FSB agents and spies. here just to subvert, undermine, and weaken the United States. Donald Trump is opening up the gates and making every American less safe and our country weaker. This has been a disaster the last 3 days, and Donald Trump and JD Vance are the ones driving all of this right now.
So the irony here is that this guy is saying that the real danger is that countries like Russia and China want to become empires. They want to invade smaller nations and take over the world. And that's bad because it means them imposing their worldview and their will onto other places. But at the very same time, he is arguing for empire. He is arguing that the democratic liberal West impose their democratic values onto other countries. And they have been doing this for a long time, for decades now, through NATO expansion and also through various different color revolutions around the world, not least of which Ukraine. So ultimately, what their worldview has to boil down to is this: Putin, bad guy. We cannot negotiate or have any diplomacy with Putin because Putin bad. Ukraine, good guy. Must support Ukraine fully and unwaveringly, even if they're getting completely destroyed and having a whole generation of young men wiped out. And this just means the continuation, the perpetuation, and the escalation of this war. So thank God Donald Trump is in office and is taking the exact opposite approach, the approach toward a diplomatic and pragmatic peace. Now, let's let Dave Smith cook.
Okay, I mean, Dave Smith, I would not share some of that categorization because I don't think this is by any means done, this scenario. I think that Trump ultimately is desperate to bring peace. He prefers peace to war. He said he'd do this before he came into office. He wants to get it done, as he does in Gaza as well. He wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. There are lots of incentives here for Donald Trump to deliver on what he said he would deliver on. So I don't share that slightly apocalyptic view of where we are. But I also think Jake makes some very good points about, when you dance with the devil, you get pricked by the horns. And a lot of people believe that the way Donald Trump interacts with people like Putin and Xi and Kim Jong-un and others is detrimental to America's national interest. What do you feel?
I mean, this is global politics always involves interacting with bad people, and it only seems like the propaganda about this, arises when it's somebody who we want to support a war against. There's how about the way we interact with the Saudis or the Israelis, for that matter? Look, the greatest thing that ever happened in the history of the world has happened over the last 30 years, and there's 1 billion people have been pulled out of extreme poverty, and a big part of that was because Richard Nixon went and talked to Mao Zedong, the most evil man who ever lived, by the numbers. And so, look, I just think there's always this fear mongering that is associated with every single war. And, you mentioned age before. I'm old enough to have lived through a lot of these wars right now. America's been in a constant state of war since at least 9/11. And of course, we know that, with the war in Iraq, it was going to be a mushroom cloud over Kansas, right? Saddam Hussein was going to give the weapons that he didn't have to the terrorists he wasn't friends with, and then they were going to nuke America. And they convinced everyone in America that this was the case. And we hear the same thing now, although weirdly, there seems to be something so contradictory here between making the argument that Vladimir Putin is so weak that he can't even take over Ukraine, even though he's been at war with them since 2014, or however you want to calculate when the war actually started. And yet also he's some huge threat to reconstitute the Soviet Union, or we just hear it asserted that China will move on Taiwan if Vladimir Putin gets to keep his percentage of Ukraine, which I'm not even saying is impossible, but it's certainly not an inevitability. By the way, I don't think we could do anything if China wanted to move on Taiwan tomorrow. And right. I think Americans have to get out of this mindset, this empire mindset. Like, just for example, imagine, let's just say there was the political will and there was the desire. Let's say that the U.S. wanted to take Mexico City. We had decided we're going to do that. What could Russia do to stop us? What could China do to stop us? Nothing. The idea is ridiculous. If we decided we wanted to do that, then we do that, period, because we're the bigger, stronger country. And that's not great, but it is the way of the world. Look, the bottom line here is that people, and I will say, like me at this point, because I've been talking about this conflict on big platforms for years at this point now. The head of NATO, Stoltenberg, I always get his name wrong, but he himself said that in late 2021, Vladimir Putin drafted a treaty between Russia and NATO, and what he was asking for was a promise that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. And he said for that he would not invade. And you know, the people like you just interviewed the great Jeffrey Sachs before we started this panel, the people like that. That's the deal we could have had if we had listened to people like that. And now, oh my God, wouldn't you give anything for that deal? Imagine you could have all of Ukraine, minus Crimea, under Ukrainian control, and all you had to give was a promise of not bringing Ukraine into NATO. Now, NATO's not even on the table anymore, and there's no way Ukraine's going to keep 100% of its geographic integrity from the beginning of the war. This is the reality of the situation. Governments are not perfect, and neither is ours, but peace is better than war. This war did not need to happen, and it's been an absolute disaster, worst of all for the Ukrainian people.
So what Dave's pointing out here about Ukraine is obviously how this could have been avoided, but also how this is going to look if there is a peace deal, and not some demilitarized zone, not some temporary ceasefire, but a real peace deal. It would mean that Ukraine can never join NATO. That cannot be an option, because that is Russia's greatest red line, and it's completely fair enough. And despite all of the talk about the resources in Ukraine and the shared lineage between the two, there's also another very, very important aspect as to why this is such an important strategic interest for Russia. People will often make the case, well, Finland is on Russia's border and Finland is a part of NATO, so then why is Ukraine such a red line? And whilst there have been conflicts in this territory, Finland is an extremely rugged land with dense forests and lakes and harsh winter conditions, which makes it very difficult to launch an invasion through there. Ukraine, however, is made up of flat open plains that offers few natural barriers for a large military. And history tells this story. The Mongols invaded through this territory in the 13th century, the Poles in the 17th century, the Swedes in the 18th century, Napoleon in the 19th century, and Hitler in the 20th century. And this may help to explain why Ukraine joining NATO and having those hostile troops on that particular border is not only a national security concern for Russia, but is actually an existential threat. Moving on now.
Some of us may not like the fact that Ukrainian martial law includes a suspension of elections, but that is the law. And so, and then the fact that the Rada made the decision to vote and give that sort of public endorsement, to me, that's compelling. Now, I do want to say, give Dave Smith credit. I finally heard him say something today that I agreed with. This war could have been avoided if we, the West, led by the United States, had responded appropriately after Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. If we had responded appropriately after they invaded Ukraine in 2014, and that's not a game. I mean, the whole world saw Russia invade Ukraine in 2014, and we did nothing when they jumped over the Obama red line in Syria. So this war is a result of failed deterrence, and trying to explain deterrence and spend money for deterrence is always a tough sell, because you have to convince taxpayers and voters and legislators of what the risk is and why you have to do it. That's hard, but it is much, much cheaper, obviously, to do that, to have successful deterrence, as we did for over 70 years after the Second World War, versus dealing with the failed deterrence we're dealing with right now. I think that for Andrew, I would just offer, as I'm pretty sure you know this, the amount of money, the 120 to 180 billion, depending on what you include in that amount, it's clearly not 350, but the amount of money that the United States has spent or contributed towards helping Ukraine, the overwhelming majority of that money was spent in the United States. It's not pallets of ammunition, of money. that are loaded onto a C-17 and then delivered into Ukraine. It's money that is spent replacing or buying ammunition, refurbishing old equipment that is then loaned or given to Ukraine. And of course, there are no U.S. troops in Ukraine except for those officers that are assigned to the embassy and the Office of Defense Cooperation, whose task is to make sure accountability of every javelin, every artillery round, every set of binoculars. Oh, you can shake your head if you want to. That's a fact. So
why don't you stop pretending that we don't have United States Special Forces on the ground right this second? We don't have CIA agents all over Ukraine right this second. Why don't you just stop pretending? Because it's nonsense. Okay. And we all know it's nonsense. This is the way, hang on. This is the way it's been going for a long time. And when you talk about, well, Andrew, what we're actually doing is we're spending a whole bunch of money on refurbishing equipment here instead of buying new equipment to send over there. So what? So what, you're still spending tons of my money on something I don't care about to send over to a nation which is corrupt as hell. So can we just stop BSing each other for a second? Yes, the United States has boots on the ground there. Yes, we have special forces units there. We have CIA agents there, and we would be fools to pretend we don't.
It's an interesting argumentative style that you had, and you know, I always, when people start calling me names or whatever, then I really, the credibility.
I didn't call you any names, sir. I didn't call you any names.
Whatever. Okay.
What was the name that I called you?
I think the key is this idea of trying to
Perhaps
end
you're just
the
offended
war.
by tone. You just don't like tone. You know, maybe a little tone policing getting worked in there. Maybe that Southern drawl where you try to make yourself sound likable because you have it doesn't work so well on me because you can't gaslight me with this stuff. It's nonsense. Yes, there's boots on the ground there. Yes, there've been boots on the ground there probably since the beginning. Yes, we're spending $100 billion plus on equipment that we then either send over there. And by the way, there's hidden money going over there too. This is such nonsense. Just stop gaslighting the American people. Stop it. We're not stupid. We've seen this on repeat so many times now. So many times.
You see, we aren't sending soldiers to Ukraine. We are simply refurbishing old weapons to proliferate this war. I mean, when you think about it, we're doing something good for the economy by helping our friends and patriots over Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. We gotta give them our billions of dollars or else those old weapons will just be collecting dust. Yeah, no, the logic doesn't really logic with that one. I mean, who gives a shit if it's old weapons, if it's new weapons, if it's going to American arms companies or other arms companies? This is still a complete waste of taxpayer dollars and also still money laundering. It doesn't really matter how the money gets siphoned into the abyss, it's still the same result. But also, Andrew's right about there being direct CIA involvement and training of troops in Ukraine. I mean, who the hell was the guy who tried to kill Trump in the second assassination attempt? Ryan Ruth, the guy who had spent time in Kiev after the breakout of the war. You know, the one that was publicly backing Ukraine, and there's so much mystery around these assassination attempts. The CIA also has its prints all over the Maidan Revolution. We've been through that many times on the channel. And also, what was Hunter Biden doing on the board of a Ukrainian oil and gas company? I mean, Mike Benz seems to think that it's a CIA geopolitical operation to wrestle away power from the Russians in the Ukrainian oil and gas sector, and to bring that power into the hands of the West.
I just had to break this down in a video to make it perfectly plain and clear to people what's happening with Hunter Biden and the CIA. Why was I saying a year and a half ago that the reason Hunter Biden is untouchable by the Justice Department is because he was part of a CIA operation, multiple ones actually? You have to understand like what's going on here. Okay, so let me just give you like a dozen data points on Hunter Biden CIA. So the first thing is Hunter was on the chairman's advisory board of the National Democratic Institute, the NDI. Okay, the NDI is the DNC wing of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the top CIA cutout used in our tens of thousands of NGO swarms. NED ranks #1. It was created to be a NGO affiliate of the CIA. Burisma was a CIA operation. Okay, let me say this again. Burisma was a CIA operation. Okay, so was Naftogaz. That's the public and then respectively the private and public natural gas companies there. There were a couple other private ones in addition to Burisma. But the CIA was trying to break down Gazprom and swing the gas market from Russia to NATO. Okay? They've been trying to do this for 16 friggin' years. It's been an in-process CIA, State Department, Pentagon project for 16 friggin' years. Okay? They were trying to capacity build Burisma and shift its board to make it U.S. controlled.
Anyways, let's have a listen to one more section.
The idea of ending the war, of course, is exactly what we would like to do, but it needs to be an end that is sustainable. And I think President Zelensky understands that he can't just sign or accept an end to the war where Russia will wait for us to lose interest, because we always do lose interest, and then they pick right back up with a resumption of the conflict after we have left or turned our back. And so I think it's reasonable to expect the Ukrainians to want some sort of guarantee, whether that's continued aid, continued equipment, or presence. They haven't. I don't know exactly what that looks like. Obviously, I would prefer to see Ukraine in NATO. We get better the day they join NATO. It's not going to happen anytime soon, especially if the United States is not willing to do it, and the Biden administration also is not willing to do it. But how do we end it when you're the partner on the other side, negotiating partner on the other side of the table is Vladimir Putin? I mean, there's no reason to have confidence that they will live up to any agreement, because there's nothing in their history. And I do appreciate that Andrew likes my North Florida accent.
Well,
let me bring in Dave. I want to bring in Dave. I want to bring in Dave. We've got.
Yeah, I never quite understand this argument that seems to just logically fall apart, that we can't end a war because the war might pick up at some point in the future, and therefore, if we don't have a perfect guarantee that, I mean, what, even if it, I mean, I don't know. I've heard the entire time through this war, including on your show, Piers, that if Putin was successful in Ukraine, then he was going to move on Poland, right? Like, this is what Joe Biden kept saying. This was the official, like, you know, fear mongering of this war. And so if you're telling me that even NATO membership isn't a guarantee, then yes, we never have a perfect guarantee. By the way, you also don't have a guarantee from any government in the history of the world. That doesn't mean that ending a war isn't still a positive. And I just want to go back to what was, you know, brought up initially. You know, the idea that this was a case of failed deterrence, and that if only we had deterred Vladimir Putin sooner, then we could have avoided this whole thing. I mean, let's just kind of quickly overlook the last 20 years of U.S. foreign policy in Europe. We've expanded NATO all the way to Vladimir Putin's borders. We constantly floated out the idea for years that we would include Ukraine at some point, give them full membership. We said point blank in 2008 at the Bucharest summit that we were bringing Georgia and Ukraine into NATO before Russia ended up going to war with Georgia there. And then we I mean, look, Piers, like we've done this before on the show too, right? But just imagine, if you can, have a little bit of strategic empathy and put yourself in the Russian shoes. If Russia, let's say the Soviet Union had never collapsed, and the Soviet Union had poured $100 million into a Mexican street protest that overthrew a democratically elected government, and they had been saying for years they were going to bring Mexico into their military alliance, and then when the new government came up, they recognized them immediately and started arming them, as Donald Trump foolishly bragged about the other day with Zelensky in the Oval Office. Piers, do you think Americans would feel that was deterrence, or do you think we might view that as a provocation? I mean, like, it's just,
Stop
by
using
the way,
logic,
when
Dave.
Donald
Stop
Trump,
using logic, Dave.
Well, look, when
let me
Donald
ask. Well,
Trump
rather than me try and
very quickly,
answer a very logical question, let me get Jake to respond to that.
So the first thing that he said, what is the concern if Russia takes Ukraine? If Russia can't even go 60 kilometers deep and take the city of Pokrovsk, what is the threat to NATO? And it's, yes, absorbing a country of 40 million people, absorbing a country that has $10 trillion of natural resources under the ground. It's the strategic location on the Black Sea. If Russia absorbs Ukraine, they will Russify the people. They will annihilate the Ukrainian identity, turn them into Russians, and then start press ganging them into the military and send them into meat wave attacks against the Baltics, against Poland and the
So that's-
Suwalki
wait, so
Gap.
the fear-
We're
the
trying to
fear is that
prevent
Ukrainians
Russia
could be
from
forced
getting
into a
stronger.
war,
And
forced
I don't
into a meat
care
grinder?
about what Russia thinks or feels. Russia is not a great power. Russia has an economy the same size roughly as Spain. Do you think Spain is a great power
Exactly.
that the United States should respect?
Exactly, dude. Listen. We are in the business of trying to be a world empire, and we're going broke. We're $36 trillion in debt because we can't afford to do it. We've blown $8 trillion in the last 20
Then
years
why
on
is
foreign
Donald
wars.
Trump talking
And
about
you're telling
invading
me-
Greenland? Why is Donald Trump talking about invading
I don't
Panama?
agree with
Why
that.
is Donald Trump talking
Okay,
about
fine.
annexing
Sure.
Canada? Why is he talking about
That
ethnic
has nothing
cleansing
to
in the
do with
Gaza
this
Strip?
conversation.
That is
okay,
empire.
See, you lost
Total red
MAGA
herring.
is
It's a
the
red
one
herring. Stay on
pushing
topic,
for
Lib.
America to
So
be
you
a
lost
global
that
empire.
point.
Lib,
and
that's
now
a
you're
total
moving-
red herring. Total red herring. Total red
Completely.
herring.
And by the way, I don't support. I don't
go
support
to-
Donald
go
Is the
Trump
after
guy
the
who
argument.
smokes and spends all day arguing with strippers and OnlyFans girls going to speak up? I don't know
They
who
make
this
better
guy
arguments
is.
than you do,
General
bro.
Ben Hodges,
It's not my fault
thank
that you
so
have a
much
low
for your
IQ,
service to
lower
this
IQ
country.
than a stripper
You're
and an
a hero.
OnlyFans
You're an
girl.
expert. These other guys, I can't take them serious.
Okay, well, I mean, listen, you just couldn't
okay.
respond
you
to
need
my
to, you
point
need to have
at all
you need to have
there,
the right
dude.
pedigree
I mean,
in order
you
to make an argument, bro.
say-
So, yes, that was just a complete red herring. I mean, this is what happens when you have somebody who is arguing from talking points going up against Dave Smith and Andrew Wilson, who are highly informed about this and who have essentially impenetrable points. This is where the leftists will go, and it's where they all go. And of course, it is, but the orange man bad. I mean, yeah, an OnlyFans girl probably would have made better points than him here, to be honest. No lies told. So anyways, guys, don't forget to like and subscribe. And also, you can check out the Not One Step Back podcast. I'm going to put our most recent episode here and a clip for you guys. Make sure to go and subscribe. We want to get to 10K subs as soon as possible. And with that, this is Jake, Rattlesnake TV, keeping you armed and dangerous.